So I'll go ahead. Okay. All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. We apologize for the technical difficulties and the delay. I hope everybody's found the link and thank you for sticking with us. So it's my pleasure to present our speaker today, Dr. Doug Weber from Carnegie Mellon University, and his talk, Implantable, Injectable, and Wearable Devices for Sensing and Affecting Neurological Functions. Professor Weber is professor in the Department of Mechanical Engineering and Neuroscience at CMU. He received his PhD in bioengineering from Arizona State and then completed postdoc training in Alberta at the Center for Neuroscience there at U of A. His primary research interest is in neural engineering, including studies of motor learning and control of walking and reaching, with an emphasis on applications to neurotechnology and rehab medicine. Specific research interests include functional electrical stimulation, activity-based neuromotor rehabilitation, neural coding, neural control of prosthetic devices. Active projects in his lab are focused on building neuro-machine interfaces to enable amputees to achieve natural control and sensation with robotic limbs. So I'll give it over to Professor Weber, and thank you very much for visiting and also for your patience as we got things.
Thanks, Jose. And hello, everyone. It's really an honor to be here. And I'd really like to thank Jose and Milos and the others that organized this series for the kind invitation. I didn't realize when I accepted that things would be as dramatic as they are now down here in the States. We are still the United States of America. And hopefully with the recent excitement in DC, things will get better in the near future. January 20th is our inauguration day, and we're looking forward to some brighter days down here. So turning away from politics and shifting our focus to research, it's really an honor to speak with this group. When I look around the world at the centers that are true leaders in the area of neuroprosthetics, and not just in the development of the technology, but in the implementation of that technology on the front lines of rehab medicine. Certainly the work at Toronto Rehab and the work that you guys are all doing always comes to mind. You guys cover a lot of ground and work with a lot of leading edge technologies. And so I hope that at least some of the stuff I present today is relevant to your research and clinical interests. So I'll cover a range of technologies that really span the implantable to wearable spectrum. And in all cases, we're interested in bidirectional communication with the nervous system, with the goal of both monitoring and treating disorders, and neurological disorders. And why won't it advance? There we go. So, so my work kind of fits under this broad category of neuroprosthetics. These are devices that are designed to interface directly with the nervous system to treat some deficit. And the reason I'm focused on these devices is that there's really a large number of people around the world that are living with deficits that are caused by a number of reasons: amputation, spinal cord injury, stroke, MS. This list, the list is much longer than the items I've selected here. But for these many patients that are that have deficits due to their injury or disease, there's really little in the way of effective treatments. If you lose a limb, there isn't yet a biological solution for regrowing that limb. Transplant procedures have had mixed success over the years, and so same with spinal cord injury and stroke. There's really no cure for any of the items on this list. And so in the absence of cures or restorative therapies, we're left with the challenge of how do we replace those critical functions that are lost after these events. And the approach that I'm focused most intently on is creating prosthetic limbs that can recreate as much of the missing function as is possible, and can be interfaced effectively with the user to try to bring back something that begins to approximate normal function, and most importantly, a normal quality of life. And here's an example. So the gentleman in this video doesn't have a neurological injury of any sort. He's an engineer working in a robotics lab at Johns Hopkins University, and they worked. That team at APL, the Applied Physics Lab, developed what is probably the most dexterous prosthetic arm ever created. This robotic arm has 22 degrees of freedom. It doesn't have the aesthetic appearance of a human hand, but from a functional standpoint, it's capable of expressing many of the gestures and actions of a human arm and hand. So it's really quite remarkable. It has the speed, strength, and dexterity of sort of an average person, which is great. But for that device to be useful for an amputee, we need a way to communicate. We need a way to enable the amputee to communicate with that arm, such that when they want to reach and grasp an object, the arm does as intended, with little effort on the part of the operator. And importantly, when the hand grasps an object, there needs to be feedback flowing back from the prosthesis to the user to alert them of touch and make the user aware of things like joint position and other senses that are normally conveyed by the somatosensory system. So essentially what we need is a bidirectional communication link between the user, specifically the user's nervous system, and this and other very sophisticated mechatronic devices. And so therein lies the focus of my work, and we rely on a number of different types of technologies for doing this. So shown on the left are devices that are designed to penetrate neural tissue with hundreds of very small microelectrodes that each provide a line of communication into or out of the brain or other parts of the nervous system, and can interface with the nervous system on a very high resolution. So we can communicate with single neurons in the brain and elsewhere with devices like this, but the price we have to pay is, in this case, a cranial surgery, which for the neurosurgeons in the room might not be a major challenge, but for patients, in many cases, it might be a barrier too high. We're also interested in perhaps lower barrier options, devices that can be delivered to critical parts of the nervous system through injectable or needle-based approaches. And an emerging technology in this space is a device called the Stentrode, which is a device that is designed to measure EEG signals from inside the skull, but is delivered to the brain not through the skull, but through the vascular networks that permeate the brain tissue. So here we have a device that is now capable of measuring electrical signals inside the skull that are much cleaner than those you can get from the scalp, and we haven't had to open the skull or the dura to get there. So perhaps the bar for such injectable solutions is a bit lower than the devices on the left, but really the ultimate or the lowest possible barrier are devices that can be worn, like the clothes that we wear every day, or that most of us wear every day, and certainly in the wintertime we wear more than others. But the ultimate technology is one that is just every day, right? We put it on and it allows us to communicate a range of intended actions and even support compromised functions, but it is no more cumbersome than the clothing that we wear and use every day. So this is kind of the spectrum of solutions that I'm exploring in my lab, and I'll try to go quickly through examples of each in this talk. And I'll try to be mindful of the time, knowing that we started a bit late. So I got my start in this working in Andy Schwartz's lab back when he was still working out in Arizona and San Diego. And at the time, Andy was working primarily in rhesus monkeys and trying to understand how neurons in motor cortex encode information about reaching movements. And he had published several science papers by this point, and they had identified really a simple linear algorithm that could predict with fairly high accuracy the reaching actions of the monkey's arm based on the activity of a fairly small population of neurons in motor cortex. And Andy, who's a physiologist by training, but an engineer at heart, realized that if they could create technology that could sample and interpret the activity of many such neurons simultaneously, then that could provide a real-time, moment-by-moment indicator of where the monkey's arm would move, and then the monkey could thus use such a signal to drive assistive devices like the robotic arm shown in this video. Okay, so now fast forward 20 years, and Andy's at the University of Pittsburgh, I'm at the University of Pittsburgh, and we started a human BCI program to basically apply this concept that Andy developed in Andy and others developed in monkeys, but we wanted to test in humans that might benefit from this technology. So the woman shown in the image at the bottom here is Jan Sherman. She is paralyzed from the neck down due to a condition that her physicians classified as spinocerebellar degeneration. There's some uncertainty as to whether or not that's an accurate diagnosis, but what is absolutely clear is that Jan is unable to move any of her limbs, even though she has some spared sensation in her arms. She is otherwise paralyzed. But she's smart and bold, and she volunteered to be the first participant in a study led by Jen Collinger, who's shown at the top right, that involves Utah electrode arrays implanted in Jan's motor cortex to measure and interpret signals related to Jan's intended movement. So Jan can't move her own arm, but we mapped those motor areas of her brain and identified that the hand and arm areas of her motor cortex that still reflected her sort of intent to move. And we placed a pair of these Utah electrode arrays in those areas of Jan's brain. And then we asked Jan to imagine moving her arm to reach and grasp various objects in the workspace and move them around. Again, trying to envision herself doing that to generate signals that we could then read and interpret to drive a robotic arm. And certainly took a little bit of training and a little bit of discovery on our part, but over a span of a few months, Jan became quite proficient at directing the actions of a robotic arm using only the neural signals that we measure from her motor cortex. And so now I'll just pause and play this video where Jan demonstrates what she was able to make possible with 200 electrodes implanted in her primary motor cortex.
5 months after the surgery, we came back to see whether she would be able to control the robotic arm with nothing but her thoughts. They plugged her brain into the computer, and this is what we saw.
I can move it up and straight down and left and right and diagonally. I can close it and open it, and I can go forward and back.
That is just the most astounding thing I've ever seen. Can we shake hands?
Sure.
No, really?
Yeah.
Like, come right over here?
Yes, you come over there.
Okay.
Let me grasp your hand there. There we go.
Oh, my goodness. Wow.
And I can do a fist bump if you'd like.
That's amazing.
So I love this video. It's old and clearly pretty grainy at this point. But what's most remarkable to me when I watch this is just how sort of free and an unrehearsed Jan's actions are here, right? She's just, she didn't practice this. She was expressing what she was thinking, both in her words and and through the actions of this robotic arm, which has become an extension, I would argue, an extension of her own body. So, she's able to do things with that arm that she would do if it were her own arm. And she's free to do that because, she has, very direct and intuitive control over that robot's actions. And so, to the point where it really does appear effortless for Jan, to behave, to use the arm to behave that way. So I think, this is a really nice demonstration of what's possible when we can establish real-time communication with really just a small number of neurons in her primary motor cortex. Right? If you think about the total population of cells that are in motor cortex and in the brain more broadly, the fact that it only takes a couple hundred such neurons to express sophisticated behaviors like the ones she just demonstrated, I think really highlights just how low dimensional our environments are. So, okay, so it's clear that that we understand enough about how information and how behavior is encoded at the level of primary motor cortex, but we also know that that activity is critically dependent on sensory feedback. And so in tasks like the one I just demonstrated, visual feedback is obviously really important. Jan's using her eyes to guide the arm and move it around in space. But we also know that the somatosensory system plays a critical role in shaping motor output at multiple levels of the nervous system. And in most cases, or most instantiations of a BCI, there is no route for delivering somatosensory feedback. Okay, so the feedback that we get from our skin and our muscles is simply not present in most of these BCI cases where people are using only visual feedback to guide their actions. So in Jan's case, because she has spared somatosensory function, we wanted to ask we asked the question, what if she actually had sensory feedback coming from her limbs? Would that improve her ability to control the robotic arm? Would it make it worse, or would it have no effect at all? Right? Normally when we reach and grasp, our muscle spindles and our cutaneous afferents are being driven by those actions, and that feedback is mixed in with the other modes of task-relevant feedback that are arriving in M1 and processed to achieve stable and reliable motor output. We wanted to see if we add that somatosensory feedback from the arm, what effect will that have on Jan's ability to control the robot? So because she has a normal sensation of touch and movement, we designed tasks where Jan performed the task in her normal way with only vision. So that's the way she's been doing these tasks at this point for many months. And then we added to that the provision of somatosensory feedback or proprioceptive feedback by simply moving the arm to follow the motion of the robot. And Rob Gaunt, shown here at the top right, was leading this project, and you'll see Rob in this video moving the arm. So she had four types of four conditions where we tested her ability to control the arm in this simple line crossing task. So she has to move the arm left and right to hit sort of open targets on either side of the arm. When we take away all feedback, so when we blindfold Jan and we don't move her arm, she's unable to do the task at all, right? The robot starts moving, she thinks she's moving it, but the robot ends up sort of drifting off into space, and she's unable to control it effectively. Then if you simply add proprioceptive feedback, as Rob is doing here by moving her arm, suddenly she's able to control the arm normally again. So she can't see the arm, but in this case, proprioception is a suitable substitute for that feedback. So she's able to track the actions of the arm using her proprioception rather than her vision. Okay, so let's dig into the data to try to get some insight into what might have been going on during these experiments. So Monica Liu is the student leading this data analysis, and she first looked at the sort of success rate, the number of times or the number of targets that Jan was able to hit in these various conditions. And so in the normal condition, where Jan has just vision, no proprioception, she's able to move the arm back and forth about 30 times in the span of a minute. Okay, and that's kind of her normal sort of practiced success rate. When you take away vision, you blindfold her, that success rate drops way down. She's able to move it a couple of times, but in general, the arm drifts off into some corner of the workspace because she doesn't have any feedback that allows her to track the actions of the arm over time. Okay, so performance drops way down when we remove feedback. Now, if we add proprioceptive feedback, our initial hypothesis was that, well, her success rate would go up, right? We're giving her more information to use in controlling the task. Certainly, her that feedback should help improve performance. But what we actually found is that the success rate dropped a little bit. I mean, it's still, very close to the level of performance seen in the normal vision-only condition, but it did get a little bit worse, and that initially was a little bit puzzling. But then the more we thought about it, the more we realized it made a lot of sense, and I'll dig into the reasons why shortly. What was more surprising, though, is that when we take away vision, which is how Jan learned how to do this task, and we only provide proprioception, she does just about as well as she does in the vision plus proprioception condition. So that means that proprioception alone does a very good job, or is very effective at supporting Jan's control of the arm. But when you blend it with vision, it seems like it has a bit of it creates a bit of a decrement in performance. And the reason for that is that when we build the decoding algorithms that link Jan's cortical activity to the actions of the robot, we're looking at how activity is modulated as Jan is visually observing the actions that she's going to eventually have to produce, right? So we're training her on a task that has vision only, and then later asking her to do a task that has vision and proprioception. So what that means is that proprioceptive input is driving activity in motor cortex that does support the task in some way, but it isn't supportive in a simple kind of linear superposition fashion. So that is, we need to figure out how to best map activity in this vision plus proprioception condition if we're going to really leverage these feedback pathways to our advantage. Okay, so let's look at this a little bit closer. So this is what the decoders that we use map neural firing rates to hand velocity. Okay, so in this task, there's two velocities, horizontal velocity and vertical velocity. The only one that really matters is the horizontal velocity. And so that velocity vector is basically flipping back and forth as Jan alternates her movements left and right. And in the normal case, with no proprioception, Jan makes these nice circular movements shown by the dark circles here. And when we add proprioception to that case, or to her arm, those circles get a little bit bigger, meaning her arm moves a little bit faster, but she doesn't hit as many targets, even though the arm reaches higher peak velocities. So the arm moves further, but it's a little less controlled than in the vision-only condition. Okay, now when we take away vision and Jan only has somatosensory feedback to use to control the arm. The velocity goes way up, and it's almost like she's sort of using like a bang for the engineers in the group, or the optimal feedback controller people in the room. It's almost like there's a bang bang control mode of control at play here, where Jan ramps up her velocity to the maximum and then just switches back and forth to alternate between left and right. And so her strategy under proprioceptive only control looks quite different than it does under visual guidance. Okay, but that means then that she's able to use the neural activity from those proprioceptive driven neurons to operate the limb. And so we looked across the population of neurons that we recorded from and tried to identify what effect does this proprioception condition have on these motor cortical neurons. So shown on the x-axis, we have a measure of how engaged in the task are these neurons. That is, how much are they contributing to Jan's control of the cursor. And on the Y, we're looking at the difference in their average firing rates between the proprioception and no proprioception condition. And what we see is that there's a bunch of neurons who exhibit very low levels of modulation, but then there's maybe a third of the neurons that exhibit very high levels of task-related modulation. So they're encoding a lot of information about the movement, and the majority of these neurons should exhibit much higher levels of firing in the proprioception condition. Okay, so we have a bunch of neurons in motor cortex that are driving this robotic arm, and they respond in a positive way to proprioceptive feedback. Thus, the velocity of the arm is going to be greatly increased because of that activity. Okay, so now we're getting some insight into what effects these various feedback paths have on coding in motor cortex, and we would like to implement that. We would like to sort of use that information then to design better decoders. And here's just another look at that. So this is now taking the activity of the entire neural population, all 200 plus channels, and collapsing it down using dimensionality reduction techniques like principal components analysis, and looking at the first principal component, which tells us kind of the strongest level of the strongest feature of modulation across these different tasks. And what we see is that in the eyes open proprioception condition, this blue case here, we see the strongest modulation. So Jan has the greatest range of control over her neural population in this eyes open proprioception condition, and the lowest level of control when there's no feedback. Okay, and that's this dark gray one here. Okay, and then the proprioception only condition is this one here, where the depth of modulation is just as high, but the rate or frequency of modulation is much lower. Okay, so what this tells us then is that Jan's ability to control her population, her motor cortical population, to produce these movements depends critically on these feedback signals. She can't simply imagine moving the arm and it achieves the same level of modulation that is necessary. She has to have feedback, and feedback from vision and or proprioception is effective. Okay. And then lastly, just trying to look at this population activity in a slightly higher dimensional space. So this is looking at the first two features in this principal component space to see, are there different zones in this PC space where we might distinguish between vision-related activity, proprioception-related activity, and so on. And the answer is yes, clearly. When there's no vision alone, the motor cortical population kind of lives down in this area of the feature space. When we add vision, things, the whole population shifts in this PC1 direction. Okay, so there's this strong shift rightward, clearly demonstrating the impact that vision has on the task. And then when we add proprioception, the space, the cluster of activity shifts even further, but now in a second dimension. So it's almost like there's two distinct axes along which vision and proprioception are contributing to modulation of to modulate activity in motor cortex. Okay, so thinking about ways we can now try to separate these two sources such that we can effectively control them and program decoders to map output of motor cortex to action in the prosthesis. Okay, so sensory feedback's really important. We know that. It's well established in the literature. So we would like to develop technologies that also allow us to restore that sensory feedback in patients that have damage in the sensory pathways that carry that information. So if it's a missing limb, we would like to be able to deliver information from the limb to the peripheral or central nervous system. If it's a spinal cord injury and there's ascending fiber tracts that are disrupted, we'd like to be able to intervene above or around the lesion to again bring in this information. Okay, so there's an open question as to where in the nervous system we can deliver sensory information. And my lab over the years has spent a lot of time focusing on peripheral nerve and spinal nerve interfaces as potential targets for delivering physical state information from the limb and then encoding it as a pattern of electrical stimulation that can be carried by the ascending fiber tracts for the brain to understand and hopefully use to improve function. Okay, so I'll talk about a project that Lee Fisher is leading that involves epidural spinal cord stimulation in lower limb amputees. So here we're recruiting participants that have had transtibial amputations, and we're doing a short-term implantation of epidural spinal cord stimulation electrodes. These are linear leads that can be routed through the skin and into the epidural space of the thoracic and lumbar spine, placed laterally to try to get close to the primary afferent neuron, to the projections from the primary afferent neurons that are entering the spinal cord on the dorsal aspect. And by positioning up to 48 such electrodes in this space, we can begin testing the effects that electrical stimulation has, both on the person's ability to perceive touch and movement in their missing limb, and also the motor effects that stimulation has on their residual musculature, right? Because our ultimate goal is to bring back a sense of touch and movement to this part of the body that's missing, but we also want to be able to improve locomotor function and balance control in the process. So we're interested in both the sensory and motor aspects that this sensory stimulation provides. Okay. So in this talk, I'll focus mainly on the motor side of things, which is the part of the project that I'm running. And here our goals are to try to quantify the muscle responses that are produced when we stimulate the spinal cord in these areas. We want to understand, we expect that we'll generate reflex responses in the muscles. Those are fairly well established, but we want to know what potential positive and negative effects those responses might have on our participants. Okay, because we can imagine promoting healthy things like normal gait phase transitions or postural correction responses, but we can also imagine producing motor responses that are disruptive, to the participant. And one of those things is appealing and the other is not. And then, so really our experiments are designed to try to map motor responses that are produced in both limbs as we move the site and change the pattern of stimulation at each of the locations in the spinal cord. Okay, and so Dev Sarma is the postdoc that's leading this project. We've done 2 lower limb we've done about 4 lower limb amputees so far. We've had a couple of problems with failed implants due to lead migration, which we've since resolved. But the very first participant that we studied was a 57-year-old male who lost his limb due to peripheral vascular disease caused by diabetes. This gentleman had 3 16-channel arrays implanted in his lower thoracic upper lumbar spine, or 2 electrodes there and 1 down in the sacral region. That sacral lead had to be removed a week into the study. But it allowed us, placing the electrodes this way allowed us to then measure EMG responses across all of the major muscles of both legs, both in the fully intact leg and in his residuum. And we performed those experiments in this case mainly while the subject was seated in a chair, but in a few cases we tested with the subject standing as well, because we know that reflexes, in particular motor reflexes, tend to be modulated by posture and behavior, standing versus walking, and so on. Unfortunately, this gentleman, because of his health condition, wasn't able to stand for very long, so we had to do the majority of the testing with the subject seated. Our second participant, who is quite an athlete and an ultra-marathoner, in fact, because he was an ultra-marathoner and exposed himself to repetitive strain injuries, that actually cost him his foot. But anyways, this gentleman was very fit, and we were able to do testing over long periods of time with him standing in a frame. He had a pair of 16-channel leads implanted into his thoracic, lower thoracic, upper lumbar spine. Just a pair of 16-channel ones in this case. And like before, we measured EMG across the many muscles of the leg. We recorded bilaterally, which in the case of this individual was really interesting. And I'll get to that in a minute. We tried to, because we were testing literally for the whole day, we used the frame to support his body weight during these experiments. But in hindsight, that may have been a bit problematic, because we saw when we moved to freestanding data that the nature of the responses was a bit different in many cases. So weight support versus no weight support can have an effect on the motor responses that we observe. So here's some examples of the responses that we see. So in this case, we're stimulating at 1 hertz, so at a rate of 1 hertz. And what we see is that at kind of typical H reflex latencies, a little bit shorter, we see responses in usually a couple of synergistic muscles at the lowest threshold. In subject 1, most of the responses that we saw were in hamstrings and one of the gastrocs. But in participant 2, we saw responses in literally every muscle that we measured, or at least all 8 of the muscles in the residual limb and most of the muscles in the intact limb as well. So the point here is that stimulating these sensory pathways can and does produce widespread effects on muscle activity. In some cases, it's clean in that we see we see responses from clear synergists that are linked through reflexes. In other cases, the responses are highly mixed, because we're activating not one, but probably many or multiple reflex pathways. Okay, so we get widespread muscle activation in many of these cases, and in every case, well, every case but one, which I won't show. This is reflexive activation. So we're activating reflex circuits, which we verify by looking at rate-dependent depression or post-activation depression of these reflex responses at higher rates of stimulation. And so what we see is when we stimulate at a higher rate, that the response, the motor response to the second pulse in the train is greatly muted because of these rate-dependent depression effects. Okay, so we're activating reflex circuits in the spinal cord in the course of doing this, and in some cases those responses are quite mixed. The latencies, so when we activate these pathways, the latencies are pretty consistent, and so depending on the group, the muscle that we're recruiting, regardless of the location where we're stimulating, the onset latencies are pretty consistent, which tells us that we're probably activating similar reflex networks in each of those cases. What was really surprising to us, however, is that we're placing our electrodes on the lateral side of the spinal cord. So we're not going along the midline. We're trying to hit the primary afferents where they project into the dorsal entry zone, because we want to activate those primary afferent pathways that are coming from the leg. And so we expected responses to be, these reflex responses to be, I guess, more unilateral than they turn out to be, because what we see is that in almost half of the cases, we're evoking responses on both sides, in both of the legs. There's a slightly higher prevalence on the intact, or I'm sorry, on the residual side, the amputated side, but there's a surprisingly large number of responses on the opposite side of the leg. However, the thresholds for evoking those responses are in almost all cases higher, right? So we have to stimulate at higher levels of current to produce activation on the opposite side. But surprisingly, there are at least a few cases where we see very low threshold responses from the opposite leg. And in some cases, the strength of activation is pretty strong. So the takeaway here is that we can produce activation in muscles using these epidural spinal cord stimulation electrodes, but it's pretty messy in terms of the patterns of responses that are evoked, and in some cases a little bit counterintuitive. Okay, and just a little bit on the organization. So as we move from kind of the rostral end of the electrode array to the caudal end, the pattern of muscle activation across the leg changes in ways that we would expect. So it's a little bit dirty, but in general, it does kind of follow maps that have been established previously for where motor neurons are located in the spinal cord. So even though we're stimulating on the dorsal aspect of the cord, as we march from rostral to caudal, the pattern of activation roughly follows the pattern, the layout of the motor neuron pools in the cord. So that's encouraging from the standpoint of trying to target muscles a little bit more precisely. And so just tying this now together with the sensory side of things. So again, one of our main goals here is to be able to restore sensation to the foot, such that if the person is using a prosthetic foot, they can actually feel it when it touches the ground and feel the position of the ankle when they're walking. And so we're interested in linking sensations that can be produced by stimulation to behaviors that the subject is performing with the prosthesis. And so this map shows the locations where the subject reports sensations that are produced by stimulation. You see that a lot of the sensations, aren't in the phantom area, the missing part of the leg. They're actually in the residual part of the leg. So clearly, that body schema is still well intact. But on a handful of electrodes, the subject does describe feeling, touch, and even movement sensations that are referred to the phantom, right? And so in this case, this gentleman had been amputated about a year prior to his participation in this study, and he's able to feel. He was able to feel his foot again when we stimulated on at least a couple of the channels. Okay. Now, what's interesting is that when we measure the muscle activity that's produced when he's feeling a sensation in the foot, we see that in most cases we see fairly strong activation in the gastroc muscles. So there's a greater tendency to produce activation in the gastrocs than there is in the hamstrings or quads, even though, across the array, these are, we see fairly strong activation in all of these muscles. But at the levels of stimulation that are used to produce sensation, which tends to be a little bit lower, the greatest tendency is to produce activation in those lower limb muscles. Okay, so that's some translational work that we're doing to try to restore sensation, or to create techniques and technologies to restore sensation to people. I'm going to shift gears now and move a little bit away from the implantable devices and more towards this concept of creating technologies that can be injectable or even body worn to interface with the nervous system. And looks like I'm already running out of time, so I'll just try to move quickly here. So one technology that we're exploring is something called the injectrode. This is a self-curing two-part polymer that is separate at the time of injection and is mixed during delivery, such that it flows freely into the tissue cavity and forms up at the target that we're trying to stimulate. So this is a conductive polymer that is sort of like a self-fitting nerve cuff that we're placing into the foramen to access the dorsal ganglia as a therapeutic target for pain. Okay, and the reason we want to use an injectrode versus a conventional DRG electrode is that these are difficult, relatively difficult to position, and don't really conform well to the irregular surface of the DRG. Whereas this, the injectrode, in principle, could be as simple as a steroid injection is for treating pain, but then also conforms nicely to the contour of the DRG, and can thus perform a more stable and long-lasting electrical interface with the DRG. So we're doing experiments in my lab to characterize recruitment of sensory fibers with the injectrode. Ashley Dalrymple, Jordan Ting, and Rohit Bose are the students on this project. And I won't go into the details of this, but we're using a cat model. We're placing, we're creating small holes over the DRG and then delivering our injectrode or our electrodes to the DRG. We're using a stainless steel cylindrical electrode as the control, and then the injectrode is injected in the way we envision to create electrical contact with the DRG. So this video just shows delivery of the injectrode through a small burr hole in the lamina. You can see the fluid oozing out the top when we do the injection. And once it's in position, it just kind of fills the void in the bone and gives us a nice electrical contact with the DRG. So we do nerve recruitment studies to measure the threshold and recruitment curve for evoking activity in sensory fibers. We do that in the main trunk of the sciatic and two principal branches. And we measure thresholds, conduction velocities, and so on to try to characterize recruitment properties for the injectrode versus the steel. And I'll just, again, try to move quickly. What we see is that overall, the stainless steel electrodes that we used in this case had a slightly lower threshold for recruiting sensory fibers than the injectrode. But I attribute this mainly to the difference in surface area. The injectrode is creating this very large electrode over the DRG, whereas the stainless steel electrode just has a much smaller footprint for contacting the nerve. And so as a result, the current density that is achieved with the injectrode is just simply much lower for equal levels of current injection. Okay, so so I think once we're able to normalize for those differences in contact area, things will look fairly similar. But even in spite of that, I mean, these are big differences in contact area. The injectrode is very effective at producing the neural responses that we seek for these pain therapies. And it's it's a far more elegant interface technology. All right, so the last technology that I want to now highlight is a sleeve electrode array, and there's a couple of different variants on this theme, but the general concept is to take electrode arrays, embed them in the fabric of garments that we wear every day, and use them to monitor electrical activity or even motion. We can embed IMUs in these as well. But if we can measure muscle activity, then we can use it as a potential indicator for actions that someone with a disability is trying to perform, and we can electrically stimulate through the same electrodes to boost activation in muscles that might be too weak to act on their own. Okay, so this is the overall concept. I know Milos and Jose and probably others in the KITE group are working in this area as well. I'm a huge fan of these technologies. I think there's tremendous opportunity here to make things that really have a realistic path to market and adoption. So here's some of the early work we did. Just first testing that we can, or first verifying that we can record electrical activity using these electrode arrays. So this is just showing that we can map muscle activity across the surface of the forearm using this sleeve electrode array developed by a company called Battelle. These are just stainless steel disc electrodes that are distributed across the entire surface of this spandex garment, which is wrapped around the forearm to make electrical contact with the skin. It was developed mainly for electrical stimulation, so they wanted to create an FES device to reanimate the paralyzed muscles of the forearm. But we found that it's a very good EMG sensing array as well, and you can see that from the data here. One of the first things we tried to do was use it to map muscle responses in the forearm during TMS over motor cortex. And here the thought is that if we could see what all of the muscles of the forearm are doing when we stimulate a focal hotspot in motor cortex, then that might give us some insight into changes in the synergy structure that tend to occur after stroke and other injuries. And so we haven't done much more work in there in the TMS space yet, but I think this is really an exciting area of opportunity for technology like this. But what we did, one of the things that we found most exciting, or at least I'm most excited about, is that this sleeve as an EMG sensor application seems to work very well in patients where I wouldn't have really expected it to do much of anything. And so the two gentlemen shown in these images at the center are both our volunteers intracranial BCI studies. So they both have Utah arrays implanted in their motor cortex because they both have spinal cord injuries that have paralyzed both of their hands. Okay, so when I first tried measuring EMG from their forearm, I didn't really expect to see very much because their hands are so paralyzed that they got a brain implant, to control devices. But to our surprise, we found that there are very strong task-related and task-specific patterns of EMG that can be detected from the surface of the forearm when these subjects are given cues to make to attempt doing actions with their hand. So this is Ian. He's being cued to close his hand or to grasp with his hand. You can see that his fingers and wrist aren't doing much, but we're still able to record fairly strong EMG signals. So we can do a number of things with that. We can map the patterns of activity across the surface of the forearm to see, to try to localize, which muscles might have spared function. So in this case, this is data from one of our Pittsburgh subjects. Nathan has some spared wrist extension movements, but his wrist flexion and his digit movements are quite impaired. So we see modest activity at the wrist and almost no activity in the forearms. You have to really zoom in on the scale here to see this activity. But what's important is that it's not zero, right? So it's detectable. It's noisy, but clearly detectable, and it's specific to the action that's being attempted. And so we can go further. We can try to identify features of the EMG signals that might be most specific to the actions that the subject is trying to do. And so the ultimate resolution is if we can get down to the level of the single motor units that are firing when the participant tries to move their arm. So in a partnership with Dario Farina, Dario's group and Alessandro Del Vecchio is shown here. Alessandro took our high-density EMG data and applied motor unit decomposition to it, and was able to identify 22 motor units in one day's testing that were active during these attempted movements of the wrist and hand. And if we look at the firing, the patterns of motor neuron firing that are produced when the subjects try to move their hand, they show clear task-related, task-specific activity. So in this case, Nathan is able to actively extend and passively flex his wrist, and you can see those clear alternating patterns of flexion and extension expressed in his motor neurons. The patterns of alternating activity are less clear when you go to joints that are completely paralyzed, like the digits. But if you do non-negative matrix, if you do dimensionality reduction on this data, you will see that there are clear flexion and extension phases in this population activity that are clearly present. So what we're seeing is volitionally modulated activity in muscles that are below the level of the spinal cord injury. So clinically, they shouldn't be doing much, but in fact, their activity is quite distinct. And so if we take the EMG power as one set of features and try to classify it, we actually do a pretty good job. We can see that there's distinct zones of activity that are associated with specific digits that are trying to be moved. Some of the digits show a lot of overlap. So when using EMG power as a feature, our classification accuracy is not quite as good. If we use the motor unit firing rates, now the zones of activation look much more distinct. And if we try to apply machine learning to this and classify which digit is being moved during each of those cases, EMG power, we do pretty good for thumb, index, and middle. We do generally poor for the ring and even the rest conditions. There's a lot of confusion between ring and pinky. I'm sorry, between rest and pinky, because the level of muscle activity produced is quite low in these cases. However, if you look at the data at the level of what the motor neurons or motor units are doing, now our ability to classify activity is actually really strong. There's a couple of digits like the thumb and the ring, which have a much lower level of classification accuracy than the others, simply because we just didn't have very many motor units for those digits. Okay, but overall, classification accuracy is pretty remarkable for a hand that is completely paralyzed. So I'm really excited about going further with this work. I think the level of control that is possible in people with spinal cord injury, I think is certainly higher than I expected it would be. And we're not the first to show that we can decode and classify EMG activity in people with deficits in their arms. But I think this is the first demonstration of doing so in a wearable, like a garment that you can literally put on in a matter of seconds and start classifying intended action. So I think there's a lot of potential here. Coupling it with FES, which I know you guys are a number of you are working on, I definitely think that that's the way to go. And I think many patients, not just people with spinal cord injury, but I think there's a number of patients that will benefit from approaches like this. So I'm not going to try to summarize all that, but I mean, I guess I'll make a very quick summary, which is that I think there's, the technology for interfacing directly with the nervous system is quite abundant at this point, and whether you want to do a brain implant where you do surgery, open the skull and dura. I mean, there's a wide variety of electrodes that are now available, certainly more so than when I was a graduate student a few years ago. But we also have, a growing number of injectable and wearable devices that are pretty competitive in terms of the level of function that's achievable. So I'm really excited about where all of these fields are moving because I think the technology options for patients is increasing in some very exciting ways. So with that, I will acknowledge the dozens of people that have contributed to this work over the years. I tried to highlight the trainees as I move through the slides, but know that it takes a village to do this kind of work. And so I'm very fortunate to have great collaborators both in Pittsburgh and beyond. And with that, I apologize for going a little bit long. Thank you for your patience, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Weber. That was fantastic. Really impressive, broad scope of work here. So we have a few questions on our Slido and YouTube websites, so I'll just read off, I guess, in order. First one, which you kind of touched on, was, are there solutions for phantom limb pain with prosthetics? Yeah, really good question. So one of the reasons why we made the first focus of, so when I talked about the spinal cord stimulation work, the first aim of that study is to understand the sensory percepts that are produced when we stimulate the spinal cord. Because we think, and other people feel this way as well, so it's not, our thinking is not unique in this regard. But there's, a growing body of evidence that suggests that the phantom limb pain that's produced is due in part, at least in part, to the loss of sensory input from that part of the body. And if you can restore sensory inputs that are linked to that missing limb, that the phantom sort of disappears. And many of the participants that have worked in Ken Horch's lab and Dustin Tyler's lab and Greg Clark, there's a number of different labs working in this area, and all have reported this. So we think that that's one of the potential benefits. Pain and pain-related outcome measures are included in this study. And in all of the subjects we've tested, those pain-related outcome measures do improve.
we don't look only at phantom limb pain. We look more broadly at pain, pain-related questionnaires. But we do think that that's probably one of the more significant benefits of restoring sensation, is that phantom pain should get better.
Great, thank you.
One of our participants, the first gentleman that I described, after about a week, he came, he had been in the study for a week, doing stimulation, for roughly 6 hours a day. And, Monday, the Monday of his second week in the lab, he came in and he's like, should this be, have any effect on how I sleep? Because, for the first time in a long time, I've been able to sleep through the night without, waking up in pain. And we're like, whoa, so clearly, there are, I think, therapeutic benefits, which spinal cord stimulation is used routinely for pain. But specifically in the case of amputees, there's some mysterious things going on, and some surprising benefits.
Great. Second question was about the BCI portion of the talk, and the first portion, and it was asking who the best candidates were for the intervention, and also what were the limitations that would, if overcome, could most broaden the scope of eligible people.
So the inclusion criteria for the study, I don't recall. Patients with spinal cord injury are the main target, the main pool of patients we're targeting. But like in Jan's case, she didn't have a spinal cord injury, but she had something functionally equivalent to that. Most of the groups that are working in this space, are working with participants that are classified as tetraplegic. That is, they have very limited hand function, but not no hand function, right? Most of the individuals I've seen and worked with, have some spared function in their arms, and they're able to use their arms for controlling their wheelchair, operating a smartphone, and so on. So the inclusion criteria are fairly open. If that was the question. If the question is who might benefit the most from technology like this, I think that's a really good question, and there it comes down to the end effector. If the end effector is a robotic arm, like we're using here in Pittsburgh, I think the robotic limbs that are available, or at least the ones that we've used, are not quite robust enough to send out in the real world to be used for activities of daily living. There is a Canadian company called Canova that makes a wheelchair-mounted robotic arm that might be a better choice. But as far as I know, people haven't tried using that in these intracranial BCI studies. Although it certainly could. I'm a little bit skeptical that a system that complicated will be that useful for sort of day-to-day things in the home. I think that a BCI for controlling a computer and for computer access, whether it's email, web browsing, gaming, I think those are things that are important daily functions for everyone, certainly not just people, not just patients. And so I think if I were to start a company, if I were Elon Musk and I was looking for the greatest potential market in the near term for this technology, it would be computer access, probably. I think that experience can be greatly enhanced for participants, especially participants that are interested in gaming. One of the Pittsburgh participants really likes playing video games, and with a high performance brain interface, like I think is possible with a Utah array. Computer gaming, might be really exciting. I don't know if insurance, or the healthcare system would be willing to provide a BCI for specifically for gaming, but certainly for other important ADLs, it would be useful. And then I can't remember, what was the second part of that question?
It was asking what the main limitation of the field was that could broaden the eligible population.
So I've my thinking on this has evolved a bit over the years. 10 years ago, all the focus was on the electrodes and how terrible the electrodes are, and over time, signal quality degrades because the electrodes fail. The tissue around the electrodes becomes irritated. We lose cells. The electrodes become encased in scar tissue. So there was all of these biological and microelectronic reasons why this would never work. Many of those problems have been resolved. We still don't have a perfect electrode, but the electrodes that are being used, the BlackRock electrodes that many groups are now using, work surprisingly well for surprisingly long periods of time, 5+ years, and in some cases even longer. So, again, it's not a perfect solution, but I think it's probably at the point where it's good enough to create a valuable product. What's not acceptable, I think, is the percutaneous connector that is necessary at present, right? So, you may have, I should have pointed it out, but you may have noticed in the videos and the photos that I showed, to use this system, we have to connect an electronic amplifier to the connectors that are projecting through the skin to connect to the electronics. And so there's this open, well, not open, but there's a skin connector margin that has to be maintained and protected, which is just not viable for an indefinite period of time, because eventually the skin will start to recede and expose the patient to infection risks. So what we need is a fully wireless system. We need a way to power the device. The device needs to be fully implantable, either self-powered or transcutaneously powered, and be able to send either the neural data or processed versions of the neural data out through a link that doesn't require an opening in the skin. And when we get to that point, then I think it's just a matter of figuring out what the optimal use case is, because I think from a electrode standpoint, we're probably at a level where it's good enough to start. From a signal decoding standpoint, we're probably at a point where things are good enough and reliable enough that we can use algorithms that can self-tune and self-calibrate. But the rest of the system, the communication and the application side of things need a fair bit more attention.
Great, thank you. We had several questions on the vision versus proprioceptive feedback, so I'm going to try to group them a bit. So one was asking whether other methods of encoding kinesthetic parameters, like auditory encoding of the parameters, might be testing as an alternate form of feedback. Another person asked whether proprioceptive control might be better if she had training in that particular task.
Yep.
And we also had a question about whether the vision setup, peripheral versus central, might make a difference.
Yeah, so all really good questions. And in terms of other modes of sensory feedback, certainly we haven't done experiments on auditory feedback yet, but I would totally expect that it would have an effect. We know that our brain tends to integrate all useful feedback. If it's useful for performing a task, whether it's for setting context or dictating moment by moment control, all feedback is generally useful if clean and interpretable. So I would expect auditory feedback would be helpful as long as it was task relevant. In that regard, I think there are some interesting questions about the types of feedback, whether it's like discrete state feedback, like contact with an object, or something more continuous, like the pressure that is exerted on the object. So in other words, what form of somatosensory feedback would be most useful to convey to the brain? Is it some, graded measure of contact force, or is it simply sufficient to tell the brain when a contact event has happened and that it needs to switch its mode of control, to accommodate that difference in context? I mean, those I think there's a lot of interesting questions there regarding the nature of motor control, that I think will help guide the best way to implement, not only the type of feedback, but the way we interpret the signals that are coming out of the brain. So we're looking at other modes of sensory feedback, or other ways to provide sensory feedback. So, for example, if all the brain needs is a contact event indicator, then things like vibrotactile or more mechanical interfaces with sensate parts of the limb would be good enough, right? Because unless you need to provide rich, continuous, and proportional feedback, if you just need to know when something happened, there are lots of ways you could cue that. And sound might be one of them. So. And we actually did some work with Battelle, our collaborators in Columbus, looking at providing vibrotactile feedback to sensate parts of the skin, and in the case of FES controlled grasping or FES enabled grasping, it was quite effective.
Great, thank you. And then the other part of that question was whether training with the proprioceptive.
Oh, yeah, that's a really key one. So I didn't describe the other half of this study because you got the sort of excerpts from the highlights reel. But so we did a second round of experiments where the decoding algorithm was trained on, during the training and calibration phase. Rob moved Jan's arm, so she was able to. So the brain was exposed to proprioceptive feedback during this crucial training step, and in that case, it definitely performs much better, right? And again, in hindsight, none of this is surprising. I guess we just didn't spend that much time thinking about what effects the proprioceptive feedback might have on the firing rates themselves. Because there had been a couple of really interesting papers by Aaron Saminsky and Nico Atsopoulos, that have shown just how effective the proprioceptive feedback can be on modulating activity in M1. But I don't think the effects that they saw in the monkey were nearly as striking as we saw in Jan. So.
Thank you. Okay, next question is now about the lower limb amputee work. And the question was, what type of stimulus encoder did you implement for the neuroprosthetic device? And did you test different sensory encoding strategies?
So so far, we've only done one closed loop controlled stimulation task in a lower limb amputee. Lee has done some work in upper limb amputees, but I think even there it was just n equals 1. We're somewhat early days on all of this. And where we're starting is just a simple proportional control code where rate of stimulation varies linearly with the pressure that's exerted, and we just measure pressure with a force sensing array. That is certainly not the most biomimetic code possible, but it's I think a very reasonable place to start.
Thank you. Another question from the same person. This was from Zurich, actually. And so asking, how many channels does the injector have? I mean, I guess.
Yeah, interesting. So right now it's just a single channel device. It's literally a blob of polymer doped with conductive materials. And so it's just this mixture that acts as a single entity. You could envision creating, multi-channel devices. It's a bit of there's an injection challenge to sort out there, but it would. You wouldn't be able to create something like a Utah array probably, but I think you could at least create a couple of independent channels in something like the DRG, which might actually work really well if you wanted to do like bipolar stimulation across the length of the DRG, as an example.
And then last question that came up while you were answering the earlier question about the BCI was, how generalizable is the BCI decoder for different users?
Really good question. So there's a couple of ways to answer that. I think if you restrict the task space to something that is reachable with the degrees of freedom that the subject is trained with, then I think that the generalizability is quite good, right? In other words, if you train Jan to do a task in 2 dimensions and then you ask her to do 3 dimensions, she's not going to do a very good job, right? But if you train her in 3D and you ask her to reach in 3D, she'll do quite well to reach just about to reach targets at just about any part of that space. There are some biases, so it does depend on the population of neurons that you're sampling. But in general, it's very generalizable. Certainly, much more generalizable than your typical kind of discrete state classifier approach, which is certainly possible to generalize a bit, but we're working with continuous degrees of freedom here, right? We can generate proportional velocity control signals that enable reaching in free space. But again, it all depends on how many degrees of freedom are provided by the decoder, because you need one for, you need 3 to control position in space, 3 more to control orientation. So if you have to control the prehensile aspects of what the hand is doing, you need 3 more. If you want to control grasping, that's a 7th. But Jan, within 6-9 months of her implant, she was controlling 7 degrees of freedom really well, and so and making arbitrary gestures. That was one of the things I tried to emphasize after at the end of her video. Like all of that was freeform, right? She wasn't trained specifically to do any of the actions that she showed, but she can just create them arbitrarily because the decoder works in this continuous 3D space, not just a set of discrete locations or gestures.
All right, thank you very much. I think we're going to stop it there for the questions. Went through most of them. Thank you again so much for the talk. Apologies to all the viewers again for the delay that we had. Thank you for those of us who stuck with us up to this point. So I guess you can't hear our applause, but I'll give you a big hand of virtual applause.
Virtual applause.
All right, thank you very much, everyone.
And thanks again for your attention and the invite.
All right, bye-bye.